Hi, I'm Mimi Gerges. There are terror groups operating all over Africa. Boko Haram in Nigeria, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliated groups. But are these just local conflicts, and do they affect the United States?
These groups in Africa do pose a threat to the United States, not because they have the capabilities today to attack us, but because they're actually building them over time.
Welcome to the Mimi Gerges Show. The number of people killed by African terrorist groups is as large, if not larger, than those killed by ISIS in the Middle East and Europe. Yet not a lot of attention is being paid to the very lethal groups operating and sometimes holding territory in places like Nigeria, Somalia, Mali, and North Africa. Here to discuss terrorism in Africa and its implications are Catherine Zimmerman of the American Enterprise Institute and Joseph Siegel of the Africa Center for Strategic Studies. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Catherine, I want to start with you. Are these groups just local and regional actors, or do they pose a threat to the United States?
These groups in Africa do pose a threat to the United States, not because they have the capabilities today to attack us, but because they're actually building them over time. And we have, for many years, conflated a local focus with the idea that that local focus will never come back to bite us. Yemen is the key example, just across the Gulf of Aden from the Horn of Africa. And Al-Shabaab has surprised the West before, in 2010 with the Kampala bombings in Uganda, and then in 2013 with the Westgate attack inside of Kenya. We've watched Al-Qaeda in Mali expand its area of attack into Burkina Faso, and has actually, I think, preempted the Peace Corps evacuation. And all of these capabilities are capabilities that are being used in local or regional fights, but are the same types of skills that would be needed to move to attacks inside of Europe first, most likely, and then, of course, back across the Atlantic Ocean here at home.
What is the Trump administration's policy toward Africa?
The policy is still being crafted, I believe, but what we've seen is a removal of some of the restrictions that had been placed on the U.S. military, particularly in its engagements in Somalia, where we can see that that U.S. AFRICOM, Africa Command, now can pursue strikes against Al-Shabaab that are offensive in nature, whereas primarily before they were defensive, or against what we call high-value targets, the Al-Shabaab leaders that were involved directly with Al-Qaeda or with attacks against the U.S. or our regional partners.
What's causing these people to join?
The majority of the fighters are joining not for ideological reasons, but really for their own personal reasons or the defense of their community, where these groups are offering paid salaries that are sometimes higher they can get elsewhere. The groups are operating in defense of their communities, where Al-Shabaab, for example, gained significant strength because it reached out to minority clans that then gained water rights and land rights. In Mali, it's rights over who decides what the shape of the future state, as that has come forward now with the Tuareg uprising from 2012 and the Azawad. And there are certainly the ideological draws, and it comes out over time. But the bulk of the foot soldiers are not looking to attack us or participate in global jihad. The problem is they add the strength to the groups, and the leadership, which has the regional jihad perspective or even the global jihad perspective, can use that against the United States in the future.
Joe, is this kind of a chicken and egg situation where the lack of stability in these governments, the corruption, the lack of representation is driving people to join terrorist groups, or is it the instability in the governments giving you this opportunity now for the terrorism to expand?
It really is a chicken and egg phenomena. I like to characterize it as it's like having a weak immune system. So when there are weak governments, weak states in Africa, it creates opportunities for these non-state actors, these destabilizing groups to gain a foothold and then to create more instability. Unfortunately, there's usually a foundation of truth in this, that in many places we're seeing these militant Islamist groups gain some traction. Those areas are far worse than other places in their countries. And so the local leaders of these insurgencies, we call them spoilers, they tend to stir up those grievances and to pin responsibility for the disadvantaged situation that people find themselves on the government.
So could this just be an easy fix for us, that we just can put a whole lot of resources into improving governance in Africa, and then you wouldn't have terrorism?
I don't think there's any one easy answer, but I think the governance element is a really important one. And it's not just at the national level, but at the local level. 12 of the 15 countries that have violent extremist organizations currently active have autocratic governments. And the same thing happens locally, where people don't feel any allegiance with the government, they don't feel they're represented, and they often feel that they're being taken advantage of. And so that creates an opening for these destabilizing groups to mobilize that support. And they are tapping into all sorts of ideological and financial interest. The militant Islamist ideology that's being promoted often from outside the continent, from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, is having an influence.
I want to talk about that, but first I want to talk about the African migrants.
Sure.
Who are they? Why is there this huge flux of Africans trying to get into Europe? Is this an economic situation? Are they fleeing for security reasons?
Well, again, it's a combination. And of course, most attention has been on the migrants who are trying to get to Europe. And a large share of those are economic migrants. But there are just as many people who are displaced in Africa, who are displaced by war, by repressive government. And in fact, there's some 22 million people who are displaced either internally or refugees within Africa. The vast majority of them don't go into Europe. 2/3 of them remain in Africa. And so it's creating lots of other sources of instability within Africa.
So Catherine, Libya is this waypoint, right, for African migrants trying to get into especially Italy and crossing the Mediterranean. What's happening there?
The migrants are facing a lot of obstacles, and it's actually become really a humanitarian crisis in terms of the disruption of the flow, where there's evidence that some of the European governments are paying some of the militias to keep migrants on the Libyan shores.
I was reading that Italy is doing that
Yes.
they're actually going and saying, I will pay you to keep people here instead of letting them cross.
Yes, and it's all getting very muddied because the UN-backed government in Libya, which really has no force on the ground, very little legitimacy, and is based in Tripoli, has somewhat outsourced its security measures and defensive measures to militia forces. And so the question,
they're not necessarily good people.
No, so it's turning into much more of a criminal racketeer in the camps, where there are reports of women being raped, of children being sold into slavery, and of men being held hostage, essentially so that their families who sent them off for hope of a better life are now being extorted for additional money before they can even reach a prospect of any chance of making some sort of finances.
And now these militias are being very well funded by Italy and maybe others.
Yes, it's changing the economy inside of Libya away from the one that used to be a little bit more legal and illicit to one that's based on criminality. And that's a real risk for the international community, because it's going to become very hard to bring those smugglers and the criminal networks back into illicit economic system.
Another layer of the difficulties that are being caused by this migration is that the whole human trafficking network has really exploded over the last 3 to 4 years. Globally, they estimate that this is a $500 million industry. And so, of course, it's the criminal networks in the Sahel, in Libya, that are gaining control of those transit routes.
So where are these people being trafficked to?
So trying to get across into Europe. And they end up having to pay up to $5,000, pay a smuggler to get across. And so all that money is creating quite a lucrative market for these criminal networks. And so it's empowering some pretty nasty characters, including some of these violent extremist groups that are already established and are just looking for another revenue source.
Well, let's talk about the money, Joe, because I know that Al-Shabaab in the past had been doing a lot of pirating and ransom and things like that. Are they still doing that? And what are the major sources of funding for people like Al-Shabaab or Boko Haram?
Well, it depends in each circumstance. Now, in the past, Al-Shabaab was in control of Port of Kismayo, and it was able to charge entry-exit fees there. It controlled the local charcoal market and so it got revenues in that way. Now, with the African Union peacekeeping force, AMISOM, that went in and helped to stabilize Somalia, they've pushed al-Shabaab out of a lot of the areas, especially the urban places that they held. So they lost some of those revenue sources, and so they're diminished in that way. Nonetheless, they still have control of significant tracts of territory in the south and rural areas, and they tax people. They control roads, they charge people as they go through, and so they continue to have access to a steady stream of income.
And just to add to that, I mean, al-Shabaab being a key example, but also jumping across to the Sahel, where these groups know exactly where the smuggling routes are and have the force to sit on top of them and charge the extortion taxes or charge smugglers for the use of the land. And that's one way that they've been able to extort the people in terms of bringing in revenue outside of what they would normally get through just taxation on goods or, the AMISOM Union taking over Kismayo meant that al-Shabaab simply set up checkpoints right outside the city, so it still retains some of the revenue. They're incredibly adaptive at being able to generate economic income over time, even as we're trying to put pressure on them.
So I know what the United States wants from Africa, right? We want a stable Africa, prosperous, not allowing these terrorist groups to operate and to give them, for them not to have safe haven. But what does Africa want from the United States?
Leadership is one thing that I've seen in almost all of the conflicts where Libyans are looking for the United States to take a leadership role inside of the Libyan conflict, not delegate it to the UN or to the EU, where we see Italy and France pursuing divergent objectives. We've outsourced the conflict in Mali to France to deal with the counterterrorism issue and then have let the African countries handle the rest of it. But what the U.S. really has is the convening power that, frankly, no other nation really has on the ground. I think the other thing that Africans are looking for is for the promises in President Obama's Cairo speech to come forward. And this is something that actually aligns very well with U.S. national security interests and our national interests writ large in terms of addressing the grievances and building up governance across the continent, where we recognize our values and try and ensure that people abroad also benefit from those.
Joe, you had mentioned this a little bit before about how radical Islamic theology came into Africa. When did it come in? Who's bringing it in? And is that still happening?
You could look back historically, and there's been instances of radical Islamic ideology taking root in Nigeria, for example, in the early 1800s. But in terms of the contemporary period, we've really seen since the 1970s and then really ramping up in the 80s and 90s. And it was fueled by the big bump up in oil prices, that there was Persian Gulf-led proselytization process.
So this is Saudi money coming in to radicalize the mosques, the preachers,
Yeah, and it's a very systematized process where they're trying to reach youth, and I don't know that they would characterize it as a radicalization process, but they're trying to promote their ultra-conservative brand of Islam.
Is that still happening? Is that money still flowing to those radical mosques?
It is, and so that money is still going, and it's going to the mosques, it's going to the schools, it's going to Muslim cultural centers, to youth clubs. So it's I said, it's a very long-standing and dispersed process, and it's unlikely to end anytime soon because this is part of a global struggle between Saudi Arabia and Iran for the heart and soul of Islam and in how it's defined globally.
But I wonder if Saudi Arabia is looking at, say, Nigerian, what we would call radical Islam, as a success for them. I mean, is this what they want, or are they starting to feel like maybe they've created a monster?
Well, I think there is some debate within Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia has acknowledged that it has its own problem with radicalization and has tried to deal with that, and it has some actually very interesting de-radicalization programs that are going on. But I think it hasn't yet reconciled what it's doing with the outcomes. And I think that's why I distinguished, what they're trying to do, what they see themselves as doing is promoting their faith. And it is these local actors, I think they would reason, are what are turning into a violent ideology on the ground, that it's the local insurgents, local warlords that are using that ideology to advance their own interest and taking it in a more violent direction.
Catherine, what are the African governments doing to counter this problem, and have any of them been successful? Are there any, happy stories out there of success?
There are happy stories, and we can look at Morocco's been incredibly successful, where the radicalization is much lower, and it's fairly isolated to actually 2 different towns inside of the country, which are receiving a lot of attention right now from programming to prevent radicalization. The challenge that many of the African governments face are, some of them are part of the problem, and this is a place where U.S. policy is actually feeding some of the radicalization, where we're partnering state to state, and the African state is the problem. But others don't have the capacity or the will. One being the fact that the infrastructure is simply not there, or they don't have the money or the human capacity to go out to these villages and deal with it. The other is the will, where sometimes the violence is coming from communal grievances, where 2 communities actually have legitimate claims on a resource or a power sharing agreement, and the government is unwilling to really step in and resolve that, because it introduces a whole nother layer of tension. And it's those local grievances, again, that are driving it. And it really comes back to whether the governments can be leveraged to change what they're doing, and whether the United States and the international community move away from simply counterterrorism, military security forces support, toward looking at the governance problems and the local grievances, very hyper-local.
I want to talk about Mali before we run out of time, because in November 2015 there was a terror attack on the Radisson Blu Hotel. 19 people were killed, including an American woman. Who is this group, and what do they want?
The group is part of al-Qaeda's network that it's been developing in the Sahel, and it's been doing so without the al-Qaeda brand name, which has meant that it's been outside of the media, because al-Qaeda has learned that if it doesn't brand itself with that label, that we somewhat dismiss these as local groups, they're not threats. But it was really something cultivated over the past decade at least, where al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, which is the group that started in Algeria, expanded into northern Mali and developed relationships with key people that were then able to identify the different ethnic or clan seams, so the tensions between 2 different groups, exploit those and develop insurgencies that they co-opted underneath their own name. They've used those to turn against the West, since the narrative is that the West has taken African resources and making ourselves rich off of the poor people.
You talked about al-Qaeda branding, and I think the narrative is that al-Qaeda has been eclipsed by ISIS, and that al-Qaeda is kind of on the way out. It's the old generation, and we don't need to worry about them anymore.
It is certainly the narrative. It's not what I'm seeing on the ground. And when you look at Africa, al-Qaeda is stronger than ISIS. ISIS was fundamentally disrupted inside of Libya, where the group is now down to a couple hundred, and
But why is that? Don't they have the same ideology? Why would one succeed in Africa and the other one not?
It's how they're working with the people. And al-Qaeda has learned over many, many failures. We should not overlook how many times al-Qaeda has failed, but has learned to work within populations that implementing Sharia, a very conservative interpretation of Islam, immediately is foreign to people who identify as Muslim, believe that they're being good Muslims, and then are told, no, this is not a Muslim life. The Islamic State came in and immediately did that, and was incredibly brutal, and actually used foreign leaders, whereas al-Qaeda is trying to work and develop its own native insurgencies.
So you think that they can actually be even more dangerous because they're doing it this way?
Yes, and because the West has been so focused on the Islamic State that it's permitted al-Qaeda to expand this way.
So do you think they want us to think that they're irrelevant?
I think it's intentional in terms of how al-Qaeda is doing it. I see al-Qaeda beginning to take the reins back as ISIS is losing inside of Iraq and Syria. I think we should look to Boko Haram in particular as a bellwether. Boko Haram used to try to want to be part of al-Qaeda. It then recognized the Islamic State and actually splintered over who the Islamic State recognized, not the leader of Boko Haram, but one of his deputies as its leader. And we now have two factions competing in the same space, which is just an interesting development.
And if I could jump in on that, I mean, I think we just have to recognize the complexity that's involved. It isn't just ISIS versus al-Qaeda. As Catherine points out, the success of either of the groups depended a lot on how much local support there was. And really, we need to look at these as local insurgencies, and primarily Boko Haram in northern Nigeria, Al-Shabaab in Somalia. You have some groups in the Sinai and other parts of North Africa. They're each sort of operating on their own sort of terms and with local issues and local actors. Now, they tap into the global ideology and the brand, but they're not necessarily getting a lot of money or fighters or equipment, technology from the central unit, whether it be ISIS or al-Qaeda. So I think we have to be careful that we don't look at this, first of all, as one monolithic challenge, but also that it isn't just ISIS versus al-Qaeda. And as we were just saying, I mean, ISIS has struggled in Africa because it's just not locally based there. It's really a Syrian,
seen as something
Iraqian.
foreign.
Yeah, and it had a certain gravitational pull when it was growing and it was taking territory, and it looked like it was very successful. They were promising this global caliphate. That was exciting to a lot of young African Muslims who were inclined towards jihad. But that appeal, I think, has really dropped a lot over the last 18 months. And so what we're seeing, I think, is reverting back to the local foundational issues that are driving these insurgencies.
So what are the trends? Where is this going? Is it going to get worse? Are things going to get better?
If we look at this in terms of just level of attacks and fatalities caused by militant Islamist groups, and we have to recognize that all these figures are somewhat fuzzy because they're hard to verify. But if we're looking at just some sort of quantifiable measures, we can say that the number of attacks has decreased since 2015.
So why is that?
Well, for a variety of reasons. I think Boko Haram was the main actor that was a part of more of these fatalities than any other group during that time. And they had been expanding over parts of northeastern Nigeria. And the Nigerian government finally decided that they weren't going to be as passive, and they ramped up their military response. They formed a multinational coordinating force with neighboring countries in Cameroon, Niger, Chad, and they've been effective at pushing Boko Haram back. As we talked about, there were organizational challenges within Boko Haram. I think they had spent their ideological, force within the local population. I think people saw them for who they were, as just a brutal criminal group rather than as a genuine Islamist organization that was promoting their interest. And so I think that has helped to lead to diminishment. We talked earlier about Al-Shabaab also facing a lot of pressure through AMISOM, supported through the international community. Yet it's a mixed picture because these groups are resilient and they're not out in either case, and they're very adaptive. And moreover, we have to be careful we don't look at this as just a military action.
Right. Are they still recruiting? I mean, is their message still resonating with the local population?
Well, I think it depends in each place. I think Al-Shabaab is doing a better job with local recruiting than Boko Haram right now. But I think so long the message of grievance is still there. The message that the government doesn't care still resonates. And again, this is with the chapeau of this global militant ideology that is being disseminated. And so people in these marginalized areas are going to be quick to accept, if not these groups, another group that comes up and promising a better life for these communities. And so the military angle is important, but we're going to need the governance angle to provide people an alternative, something they can believe in, something they feel some ownership in, something they think cares about their interests. We're going to need some targeting of youth, helping youth to see that they have a vested interest in stability and that they have a future, that there are employment opportunities, that they can develop some of their interest. Africa has this huge youth bulge. There's 450 million Africans that are going to be coming of employment age in the next 25 years. They need some viable livelihoods for them to buy into this. So I think we're going to have to respond on all those different levels if we're really going to stamp out and delegitimize this ideology.
I want to thank you both for being on the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been the Mimi Geerges Show. You can see all of our programs on WHUT.org and YouTube. Connect with us on Facebook and Twitter and leave me your comments there. You can also subscribe to our new podcast on iTunes. Thanks for watching, and I hope you'll join me again next time.